So let's consider now, as we move forward, 3 levels of technique and how they might influence buy-in. We'll talk about this in greater depth, and I'll explain what I mean by level 1, level 2, and level 3 in a moment. All of these concepts, by the way, are included in a book, Level 3 Leadership, Getting Below the Surface, at this point in its 5th edition. And this will provide a reference for our online course here. You can read the chapters, study them at length, or you can go back and review what we're doing here on this online version. But the concepts, including diagrams, examples, and more text, are included in this volume. Let's come back to this issue of levels for a moment, and let me invite you to consider this pyramid. And at level 1, what I will call level 1 is visible behavior. These are the things that people say and do that you can capture on film. So when people speak, when people act, when you observe them, they are exhibiting visible level 1 behavior. Now, let me ask you what may seem like a fairly simple question. In your life thus far, given all the people that you have met in your 25, 35, 45, 55 years of life, what proportion of these people's visible behavior would you estimate to be habitual? Now, by habitual, I mean unthinkingly repetitive. People go through the same routines, or they exhibit the same routines day in, day out. So habituality is the mindless repetition of behavior. So in your life and career, given all the people you've met thus far, what proportion of their visible behavior would you estimate to be habitual? Write that down, please. What's your number? And now let me ask you to consider what I will call level 2, conscious thought. We all think, we know that we think, yet we don't necessarily reveal everything we're thinking to others at level 1 by talking about our thoughts. Sometimes they leak from level 2 to level 1 in a frown or a smile or a sigh or a shrug. We give these little indications of what we're thinking at level 1, which other people may or may not pick up on. They may or may not be sensitive to the signals that we are sending, whether we intend to send them or not. So clearly, if you're playing poker and you don't want to know other people to know what you're thinking, you try to develop this demeanor where you don't give any signals. Well, you're trying to manage that leakage between level 2 and level 1 so people can't make inferences accurately about what you're thinking about. So let me ask you this question again. If you think about all the people that you've met thus far in life, what proportion of the way people think would you estimate to be habitual? Now, we can't really see what people are thinking. Everything below the double line there is invisible. But nevertheless, people will give us indications of what they think by what they say and how they behave. So after you've met a person a couple of times, you begin to get insight into how they think. So here's the question. Given all the people that you've met thus far in life, what proportion of the way they think would you estimate to be mindlessly repetitive or habitual? So maybe you're in a meeting and people open their mouths, they begin to speak, and you can predict, you understand whether they're going to take a mathematical approach, whether they're going to take a non-mathematical approach, whether they're going to take a market-oriented or a customer-oriented approach. You can anticipate what they're thinking and therefore what they're going to say and do. Write that number down, please. Now, if you'll consider what I will call level 3, these are our semi-conscious, perhaps pre-conscious values, assumptions, beliefs, and expectations about the way the world is or should be. I say semi-conscious because we frequently aren't aware of our values, assumptions, beliefs, and expectations until we run into something that abrades them, that violates them, that causes us an irritation or an angry reaction. Whenever we have an irritated, annoyed, or angry reaction, what's happening is we have a belief, an assumption, an expectation that's not being met. And when that's not met, we find that abrading or annoying or irritating. So we don't often think consciously about these, and we have hundreds of them, and they're there. And if we turn the spotlight on them for a moment, people will begin to think about, do I believe this? Do I believe that? Should professors be wearing a white shirt and tie? This professor is wearing a black turtleneck, so am I having a vague abrasion here because it's not what I expected? Well, whenever that's happening, I invite you to pay attention because you are revealing to yourself a vabe, a value, an assumption, a belief, an expectation about the way the world is or should be that may or may not be true, may or may not be functional, may or may not help you accomplish your purposes in a leadership role, particularly if you're working across cultural boundaries in different nations, different regions, different ethnic groups, and so forth. So the ability to identify and understand underlying vabes in yourself and in others is a critical skill. So let me ask you, write down, if you would please, given all the people that you've met thus far in life, in your experience, what proportion of their vabes, their values, assumptions, beliefs, and expectations about the way the world is or should be, would you estimate to be mindlessly repetitive or habitual? Write that down, please. Now, let's, you can imagine doing the research on this would be difficult. Just to study level 1 behavior, you'd have to follow people around 24/7 with a camera, record what they did for several weeks, and then have a panel of experts decide how much of the behavior is repetitive. Well, I've asked these questions of people all over the world. In my consulting practice, I've had the opportunity to work in multiple countries in Europe, multiple countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in China, Japan, Australia, Central America, Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, all over the world, Australia. And on average, people will say, with regard to level 1 behavior, 75%, level 2, 85%, and level 3, 95% plus. Now, I'm not sure what your reaction to this might be, but think about it for a moment. If these numbers are even marginally accurate, what are the implications for you in a leadership role? What are the odds that you can get somebody to do something, think something, or believe something that they don't already, and change those levels of behavior? The odds are low. The same is true for an instructor, a teacher. So when I go into a classroom, I understand that most of the people in the room, and perhaps most of the people viewing this program, will be creatures of habit to the point where anything I say or do is not likely to change what they do, what they think, or what they believe. Why would one even try? Well, the answer is we hope to engage the 25%, the 15%, the 5% who are willing and open to the possibility of doing things in a different way. Now, if you are skeptical about these numbers, I invite you to look at various parts of the globe. Look at Northern Ireland, look at Serbia and Croatia. You can look at Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, pick your tribe, the Hutus and the Tutsis. You can look at the Middle East, Shia and Sunni. You can look at India and Pakistan, or Tibet and China. You pick your part of the globe, and it's pretty evident that people's underlying beliefs about the way the world is or should be persist generation after generation after generation. And therefore, their openness, their willingness to change the way things might be is relatively low. Now, we could argue, and I think it's an important discussion perhaps for another course, that the political leaders and the religious leaders tend to inhibit our ability to move away from prejudice and conflict. And it's the business leaders of the world, those who are willing to compromise their underlying vibes for the sake of doing a business deal, who are actually going to be on the vanguard of creating, shall we call it, to coin a phrase, world peace. So I find it intensely rewarding to work with international business people because they are willing to cross cultural, religious, ethnic, regional backgrounds and boundaries in order to conduct business. And in so doing, they become more tolerant, they become less judgmental, their expectations are relaxed a little bit, and the world can move forward. So I invite you to think about the degree to which people tend to be creatures of habit, and also to think about your own habitual points of view. For example, some people take, we know, a follower's point of view. And we know this because they say things like, at level 1, what do you want me to do? When do you want me to do it? How do you want me to do it? How are you going to measure me? And what's going to be my reward? These people have a follower's perspective in a fairly habitual point of way. Some people take a bureaucratic point of view. We know this because they say things like, well, that's not how we do it around here. It's not in the operating procedure. That's against our culture. Have you filled out the form yet? In fact, I was having this discussion with a group in Germany one point, and there was a participant in the room said that she was embarrassed because her company was so bureaucratic, you had to fill out a form to get the other forms to fill out. So a line of forms indicative not just of her point of view necessarily, but of the cultural point of view of her particular organization. Some people take a leadership point of view. And interestingly, in my experience and also in my research, it's not dependent on a person's title. In other words, just because you've been appointed or assigned a leadership role doesn't mean that you will suddenly become an effective leader. You are an occupant, an incumbent in a position of authority, so we might accurately call you an authoritor. We may or may not call you a leader accurately until we discover what you do and whether or not that's going to be effective. We might end up more accurately describing you as a bureaucrat or even as a follower. So just because you have a title doesn't necessarily mean we can call you a leader. But let's think for a minute about what I will call the leadership point of view. I think it has 3 elements. The first is, do you see what needs to be done? Have you ever been in a room or in a meeting where people will, in a discussion, somehow cut to the heart of an issue? And they don't get bogged down in the weeds, but they can really zone in on what the core issue is. This is an important skill, the ability to not get bogged down, but to, in a broader perspective, see things and understand what the most important issues are. The second characteristic of the leadership point of view is that they understand all of the underlying forces, not just their favorite ones. So sometimes finance people will be promoted to senior positions of executive responsibility, and they look at everything as a finance issue. If an operational guy gets promoted to management, they may always look at things as an operational productivity point of view, and so forth for the other disciplines. But a truly effective general manager, an executive, has the ability and the understanding to embrace the challenges, the forces, the issues, the speed bumps that occur in all of the aspects of an organization, not just their favorite one. And that's an important issue. Then we could say, well, okay, there are a lot of people who see what needs to be done. We usually call them journalists. They're out there writing every day about what the problems are. There are a lot of people who understand the underlying forces. They study, and many of these people we call professors or consultants. But then the third issue is, do you have the courage to initiate action to make things better? In other words, it's one thing to understand what the problems are. It's quite another thing to have the courage to initiate action to address them. And sometimes people do that wisely, sometimes not so wisely. In my experience, many people will actually shrink from that responsibility, either because it's too heavy or because they feel like they don't have what it takes to make those decisions effectively.